Shalom, my bitches. Myanda's here with NFY bringing you A Capacity for Violence by Sandtrout. Humans? I love them, but they terrify me. It's not their armies or governments. Those are held on such a tight leash that you know more or less when and why they go to war. If anything, it's weird how determined they are to make sure you know exactly why they've declared war. That's kind of beside the point, though. Here's why humans terrify me. You've probably heard about the attack on the Luminal Ascendance Casino by the Click-Tack terrorist group Chichenist Supremacy. I was there with my mate. We were on vacation and enjoying our accommodations in the hotel when the first bombs detonated. The panic was almost instantaneous, and the crack of kinetic weapons fire didn't help. Instincts can be a son of a singularity in these kinds of attacks, and I barely remembered enough of my militia training to not crawl into the darkest alcove I could find. As it was, I had to drag my mate out from under the bed. My stress hormones must have been turned up to 11 by then, because I left marks in their arm that required stitches afterwards. We ran into the emergency lit halls, and I saw the first hint of human terror. One of the human guests wasn't running, but knocking on doors and directing the stunned occupants towards the emergency exits. He saw me and my mate and waved us in the same direction. I looked back as I reached the emergency stairs to see the human running down the hall with a pair of young kith in his arms. Their parents were nowhere to be seen. I held the door open just long enough for him to get through, but then I saw a black bouncing object that stirred militia training scenarios in my memories, and slammed the door shut behind him just as the shockwave of the fragmentation grenade nearly rattled my teeth free of my head. There was nothing currently blocking our path down, but he looked down the emergency stair before turning around, kith juvenile still in his arms, and charged up the stairs. "Up! We have to go up!" I heard him call, and my mate and I scrambled after him, not understanding why, until the panicked screams below us were joined with the snap of hypersonic projectiles. Once on the roof, my mate and I paused to catch our breath, but the human only stopped to set down the wailing juveniles and break off a loose bit of metal framework before heading back into the stairwell. I was about to join him in his apparent rush to a glorious death, but he held out a hand to stop me. "Take care of those two kids. I've got friends down there waiting for me." This snapped me out of my hormone-fueled haze. Of course, this human was probably military special forces or something that was on leave. How else, other than thorough conditioning, could he be thinking so clearly in a life-or-death situation? So, I obeyed and stayed on the roof, helping more survivors and keeping them away from the edges of the roof. I didn't think there were any more attackers that might be shooting up at anyone who peeked over the edge, but without the immediate threat, I was able to reason out that it was safer to be certain. I noticed several survivors who were covered in green blood that couldn't be their own. Last, I saw a pair of humans carrying up the human that had left me up on the roof. His leg was apparently bleeding from a compound fracture below the knee, but he was conscious and still gripping his makeshift club, which was now covered in green ichor. He screamed as they finally set him down and called on the others to bar the door. I was one of the few that had enough mental coherence to respond, and we quickly had the door barricaded. It wouldn't stop a gunshot, but it would slow down anyone trying to get through, so they would be firing blind at least. Once the task was completed, I turned to the trio of humans, who I now noticed also wielded bloody improvised weapons. One was a male that had apparently acquired a fire axe that he had put to good use, and the female held what I could only guess was a broken glass bottle that was completely obscured by gore. I noticed she was covered in red blood, but showed no apparent wounds herself. The seemingly unwounded pair were wrapping a belt around the leg of the human I was currently mentally labeling Club in lieu of a proper name. I later learned that this was called a tourniquet and involves cutting off all the blood flow to the limb. No, that's not terrifying. First aid varies widely between species, and I've heard of stranger, necessary actions for trauma. We huddled up there for what seemed like hours, but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, before the local authorities arrived. Right about then is when the banging on the barricaded door started. We'd sorted out that it was click-tacks attacking and slaughtering anyone and everyone they could find. Not that the fact reassured anyone. Thus, this spurred individuals that judged they could climb down to start scaling the structure even as the fire ladders were being raised. I hesitated, looking to the humans who had dragged Club to the edge of the roof, before returning to either side of the door, waiting for the first poor son of a singularity to come through. "Go!" commanded Axe. The snap of kinetic slugs through the air rang out as the escape ladder was raised to our position, and Bottle and Axe urged me to help people get down. The barricade was coming loose, and once the door had creeped open far enough, Axe brought his weapon down on something that clattered in pain, like a wrench in a jet turbine, and several shots cut through the wall just as Axe retreated. My mate was already on their way down, and I was helping the paramedic with Club when the click-tacks finally broke through. I saw Axe and Bottle offer me only a quick glance before they charged into the oncoming anthropod terrorists. Bottle tackled one, driving it back into the others, while simultaneously lodging her broken bottle into the soft spot of its neck. Axe brought his blade down in an overhead strike that split the cranium of another. "Run!" I heard Axe cry as they laid into the attackers, more taken aback by the proximity of the human threat rather than the reality of a fire axe and broken bottle against mass accelerators. I finally flung myself onto the rescue ladder, and my last sight of the pair was Axe's torso being splattered by a burst of kinetic accelerator fire, and click-tacks desperately pulling at Bottle, who was stabbing anything and everything, too deep in the midst of her enemies for them to risk shooting. Still, for all her fury, she did not survive being outnumbered with only an improvised weapon. Police marksmen covered the escape of those who were still lowering ourselves on the ladders, as several click-tacks came up to the edge of the roof, once they had assured those two heroic humans were dead. Once I verified my mate was safe and relatively unharmed, I sought out Club and found him in the emergency triage camp. His wounds were apparently considered non-immediately life-threatening, and there were too few ambulances for the number of casualties. "Thank you so much," I offered, knowing it was pitiful recompense for what he had done. He nodded, then asked me, "Brick and Anna?" I hesitated before answering, astonished for his ability to even consider the situation outside his wounds. "They did not make it." "Son of a bitch," he muttered as he closed his eyes. "What military were they with?" I asked in turn. He looked at me blankly for a long moment before responding with a question of his own. "Military? You three are military, right?" "I assumed." I trailed off, feeling strangely awkward considering we had just survived a mass murder. "What? Fuck no. We're software engineers here for SimCom," he stated, referring to the simulated intelligence convention that was being held at the casino. "Well, Anna was a tech in the Navy, but it wasn't like she was a Marine or something." "Oh," was all I could think to say. "You saved us back there. They died so we could escape." I hoped he would be consoled knowing his friends died well. Then he glared at me in a way that I could read the anger and sorrow in spite of any differences in body languages between our species. "Don't fucking tell me that!" It was then that I realized that his friends dying so that he could live hurt him more than the fractured bone in his leg. He and his friends were regular civilians, with no particular training. They had charged repeatedly into gunfire, with nothing more than improvised weapons. Two fought knowing their certain deaths would only buy seconds for the rest of us. And the one that survived resented that he survived because his friends died. That's why I love humans, but they terrify me. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave a like or comment if you have anything you want to say to me. And if you would like to be notified of any future videos that I put up, please subscribe to my channel. Also, for those of you who were not aware, I've started putting up content to SoundCloud. A link will be provided in the description to this particular video. Alright guys, have a nice one y'alls.